thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. What a privilege it is to share a table, a fireside chat with Laurence. These obviously are issues that are very much at the front of everyone's mind these days. The links between climate and trade, I think they would have been that way even without the disruption that has been caused in the multilateral system by the changing position of the U.S. administration. I wanted to focus on this aspect of how these issues are playing out in the multilateral context of the climate change negotiations, because Laurence has said this is increasingly being raised in the international negotiations. In particular, for the past 4 or 5 COPs, I think your question referred to as the CBAM bomb has been lit just prior to the start of these conference. The parties doing a proposal from the basic countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, to add an agenda item to the COP, focusing on what are called unilateral coercive measures used to achieve climate change objectives. And they obviously have in mind, when you get into conversations with them, an effort to attack EU policies, in particular the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the CBAM. So far, that bomb has been largely diffused. I think it will be presented again this year in one form or another, through arguments that we've made that we understand the concerns behind the proposals, but that the proposals are a bit misdirected in their nature. First of all, because they're picking the wrong jurisdiction. If what they want to do is to challenge the consistency of an EU trade-related climate measure with essentially WTO disciplines, they claim that these are arbitrary and unjustifiable measures. We're all familiar with those standards from the WTO context. The UNFCCC is not well set up to deal with that kind of a challenge. We don't have a dispute mechanism that allows an independent arbitrator to look policy by policy at whether or not those policies are consistent with agreed disciplines. The other difficulty with the way in which they're presenting the issue is the way in which it's framed. They want to look at what they call unilateral coercive measures put in place by developed countries and their impacts on developing countries in particular. I think even if you take some of their concerns into account, you can understand that that's not a fair way of framing the issue in a context where we're seeing a lot of spillovers taking place between the climate policies that are being implemented in various jurisdictions around the world. And those impacts aren't all negative. Some of the spillovers are very positive in their character. And they're certainly not all the impacts of policies put in place by developed countries, at least as they're understood in a climate change context, on developing countries. So we often point, for example, to the efforts that China has been making to support its domestic industries in the clean tech sector and the low carbon sector, and how the results of those investments have led to the flooding of markets around the world with low cost, for example, solar panels that have had some positive impacts in the sense that they've made the implementation of renewable energy policies more affordable in certain jurisdictions, certainly in the EU, but also negative impacts in the sense that they have basically undercut the ability of certain sectors in the EU renewables economy to compete fairly with Chinese imports. So the framing of the issue is wrong in that sense for the EU to have what we think is a fair conversation about the relationship between trade and climate-related measures. We are helping and working to reframe that. Those of you who follow these issues closely will know that we've just agreed in the context of the response measures agenda under the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement to discuss the positive and negative spillovers of response measures in a context in which we will be looking at all measures in an even-handed way, not with the purpose of challenging whether or not any particular measure is violating a discipline, but rather having a conversation about the challenges that many countries face in the context where all climate policy at the end of the day is nationally determined, and NDCs are nationally determined, domestic policies to implement them are nationally determined, but there are spillover effects that can be more effectively managed through deeper international cooperation. And I think if you look at the way in which the Clean Industrial Deal has been framed, which is an effort to ensure that EU industries can continue to thrive and the EU economy continue to prosper in a context where we maintain our commitment to decarbonizing and getting to net zero by 2050, that it contains much more of an invitation to create partnerships and to create conversations where those countries that have made similar commitments to that transition can cooperate more deeply on the way in which they design their policies and the way in which they can develop standards that help all the international community to benefit from this transition through markets that are green, that are open, and that are fair. So you see in the Clean Industrial Deal a recommitment by the EU, not just to the fundamentals of the European Green Deal of transitioning to net zero by 2050, but also the commitment to do that in accordance with the multilateral rule-based system. That's Paris, obviously, but it's also very important with the WTO disciplines as well. A commitment to reach out to our partners much more earlier and much more intensively in terms of the potential impacts of our policies on them, to engage in those conversations in a much more proactive way than we have done in the past, so that their inputs can actually help to design, or in the context of something like CBAM, to redesign our trade-related climate measures. But also this reference, I think it was already made in the introduction, to clean trade and investment partnerships, a new, much more specific offer of how we want to engage with our partners to ensure that we can develop together mutually beneficial relationships that involve regulatory cooperation. How can we design our climate policies in a way that's mutually beneficial, but also that can increase trade and investment flows between us and our partners. So yes, there's a lot of criticism out there. There's a lot of pressure out there. To me, there are many positive aspects of that, because it does show that more and more jurisdictions are taking their commitments as reflected in their NDCs seriously. And in doing so, we're having these somewhat parallel domestic conversations about how we achieve that dramatic decarbonization in a way that ensures that we have prosperous, still industrialized economies to deliver the benefits to our citizens. So I'll stop there.
Thank you both. And I think we'll conclude with one question. No.
Something responding to Jake, because it's a sign, if there was one sign that Fireside is working, is that now it's introduced and linked with economic policies. And your demonstration was very, very just evident. So that I think is a very strong argument. Second, I think, yes, we need to think about what kind of consultation Jake is suggesting. And I think this network can do a lot. So really, I encourage you to reach out to emerging countries, groups, try to understand their concerns. CBAM discussion had changed totally. I'm sure Jake received many demands from many emerging countries saying, how can you use CBAM for our own good? So that's a sign of the success of this measure.
Thank you. This is very frustrating because we had so many other questions to ask, but thank you for your understanding. This is only the appetizer and the very first food for thought for what promises to be a very interesting day. So thank you so much for opening the conversation, both of you. And we'll directly if I can invite directly the speakers of the first panel on trade and climate to join me on stage with Emily, and I give you the microphone.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, and thank you to IEEP and to Pierre for inviting me to moderate this panel. My name is Emily Firstly. I'm a senior associate in the trade and industrial practice at Global Council. I couldn't be joined by a more esteemed panel of experts, so it's my pleasure to introduce them. We have Carolyn Deere-Beck, Executive Director of the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs. We have David Kleeman, Senior Research Associate at ODI, Eli Sandler, Research Fellow at the Belfer Center of the Harvard Kennedy School, and Yeva Barshauskaite, let me know if I said that correctly, Lead on Trade and the Green Transition at IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We're meeting at a time of unprecedented strain on the global trade system. I think an obvious pressure point there is the announcements that were made on April 2nd. I got challenged by Antoine not to say the word tariffs, so I'll do my best. But the truth is that the system has been under pressure for much longer than that. From green subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act to CBAM, the deforestation regulation, the CSRD, the CSRD, and a whole lot more acronyms. We're in an era where the traditional boundaries of trade policy and really industrial policy are being redrawn. On the one hand, there is a growing number of unilateral climate-related trade measures, and on the other hand, we have a multilateral trade system which, despite what some would say, is still anchored in the WTO and struggling to process and guide these shifts. At the same time, we have the 14th Ministerial Conference and COP30 coming up. And this isn't just an opportunity to get the trade or climate communities together. It's an opportunity to decide whether climate ambition will be pursued through cooperative frameworks driven by unilateral action or undermined altogether. At MC14, we have a narrow window of opportunity to restore the credibility of the WTO's role in that agenda. And I think that means, at a minimum, addressing the vacuum in rulemaking, including around climate-related trade measures. And at best, it means making space for new forms of cooperation. The NLM will test major economies and see if they can show real commitment to global equity in the absence of peers, especially on climate finance and a just transition. But it will also test, and I think Jake made that point, whether trade tools like CBAM or broader supply chain due diligence measures will be seen as enabling solutions or rather as barriers dressed in green. So I think what's at stake here isn't just technical alignment, it's political trust. And that trust has been seen to be eroding, not just between North and South, but also within long-standing alliances like the transatlantic relationship. So I think today's panel is very well placed to unpack these dynamics. We'll explore whether the EU can credibly lead on this agenda, what role, if any, the transatlantic relationship can play, how we can ensure inclusive cooperation, and hopefully provide a little bit of guidance on how politically and practically we can align the trade system with the pace and scale of the climate transition. All in the next 55 minutes. So, yeah. I'm just kidding, but I think that's a good way to start. I'll turn to you first, Carolyn. You're based in Geneva and have regular interactions with various member states. Amid these global escalating trade tensions, what opportunities, if any, still exist for multilateral cooperation to align trade policies with climate ambitions? And how can we ensure that we take an inclusive approach even when we're seeing increasing fragmentation?
Thank you very much, Emily, for the introduction and for Green Trade Network for having me today. These are big questions. Our work at TESS every day at the multilateral level is trying to focus exactly on how we can move ahead with inclusive cooperation on trade and climate and trade and sustainability more broadly. So in the current context, the challenge I faced in preparing today is how to be both realistic while also forward-looking and hopeful, because we know that hope is essential to drive and sustain change and for seizing the opportunities that do exist. So stating the obvious, we know it's a tough time for the global trading system. It's a tough time for delivering urgent climate action. It's a very bad time for development cooperation of developing countries in the global system at the moment. Withdrawal of aid from many countries, not just the US, and has implications for climate finance, for climate cooperation, and will have immediate impacts on poverty, food security, humanitarian assistance, and so on. So we have to bear this in mind as part of the wider context, and the Trump tariffs will make that worse, particularly for these developed countries. So when you're thinking about international cooperation, the key thing is how can we bring that diversity of countries on board? Not just the least developed, but also the smallest and most vulnerable to climate impacts, and also the broad range of middle-income countries and medium-sized developed countries who are not necessarily part of the big power play between emerging trading partners. So what I hope to do today is give us a few hints of how we might be able to do that and where multilateral system fits in. And I'm sure I'm going to run out of time, so just tell me when I run out of time and we can come back to it and the questions. So just firstly, just to step back, I always try and keep things in perspective. So on the one hand, we know we're not achieving the urgent climate action we need. We know that we've been talking about climate and trade for a long time. And whilst we've seen some important developments, we haven't seen the collective action that's really been needed to harness the role of trade and trade policy and really helping to drive forward climate action. And more importantly, to do it in a way that brings developing countries with us. We know there's rising tensions over TRCMs and that these may slow delivery on climate goals. We know that all countries face challenges on how to prosper while carbonising, right? This is not distinct to the EU or to the US. All countries face domestic politics around that, and many are being hit harder than others by the climate crisis as well. We know that developing countries fear marginalisation in the green transition, especially as they are also trying to build resilience of their economies, seek new economic opportunities, be part of the most competitive value chains, and so on. It's taken a long time, I think, for stakeholders interested in the climate and trade discussion to recognise that tackling these development issues and this economic justice and climate justice issues will be critical to making progress. The other stepping back reflection I had is that our approach to international cooperation on trade and climate needs to recognise that these are long problems. Colleague Tom Hale at Oxford wrote a great book about international cooperation on long problems and how this requires different approaches, because we're not going to solve the development, the climate, or the trade challenges we face this year or next year. We need to have iterative cooperation over a long time, over 20, 30 years. We have to be sure that the institutions and processes we're building and approaches we're building are ones that will help us sustain and build that cooperation, be flexible over time. Otherwise, so change both needs to be sort of systemic, but also incremental. But I think it's important to see these as long problems, and it might change how we approach them. So on climate and trade specifically, what have we learned? We've learned that no country can go it alone. We know that decoupling and fragmentation won't help us deliver climate action. We know more now about climate issues and trade issues than we did 5, 10 years ago. We know much more about potential solutions. We know that we have to connect the dots between trade, climate, and development. We know that we'll need fairer partnerships with developing countries. We know that we'll need to break down silos domestically and also internationally between the various multilateral processes. And I think for all countries, we know that progress on climate and also on trade and climate will require us to focus on the economic opportunities at hand. And the economic costs and trade costs of inaction as well. So fast forwarding to today, what does this mean? It means first, solidarity is more important than ever. It's a time for EU stakeholders, partners, governments to show even more interest in supporting developing countries in the transition to a green economy. It's a time for cool heads and some patience. We don't know how the Trump tariffs will evolve or what will happen. But regardless of existing tensions, cooperation on climate can't be put on hold while waiting for the stars to align. And the good news, I think, is that most countries recognize this. Aside, whatever Trump is doing, developing countries are more engaged than ever constructively in trying to identify and find pathways forward on a range of different climate and trade issues. BRICS just created a climate and trade work stream to their work. We have a broad range of developing countries participating in the coalition of trade ministers on climate. We have a new acts agreement that involves diversity of countries, and we have a growing range of proposals at WTO from developing countries on what kind of cooperation they seek on trade and climate. So you have to see them as allies. I think that's the most important message that they would give. They want to be allies and partners in the net zero transition. They want to see this as a way they can build participation in the green economy. And they also urgently want support to address the adaptation challenges they have and the immediate losses that the climate crisis presents for their trade and economies. So I think the core thing is there's recognition from members that I see every day in Geneva that multilateralism matters. In the past few weeks, you see a broad range of countries participating actively in trying to forge ways forward on this, despite the bigger political drama at hand. I'm not saying multilateralism is everything, but I think it's a key part of the puzzle. Countries will simultaneously do things unilaterally, bilaterally, plurilaterally, regionally. They'll seek Pathfinders initiative, but this multilateral piece is the most promising one for having more inclusive international cooperation. So one of the points I wanted to make is why we should still be positive about multilateralism itself. So sure, it's not the fastest way to generalize outcomes and impacts. I mean, I was 9 when the UNFCCC was signed. We haven't delivered what we needed on climate action in my lifetime, So I think we have to recognize that, but we do know that they play an essential role in building a narrative, generating and sustaining norms, understanding other countries' challenges that they face, building bridges and so on. That might not sound enough, but we're not going to get enough without at least having those things as a basis. And so this is a time when I think we most need to invest in the idea of multilateralism and a dialogue and a shared understanding and a building and sustaining that. The good news is I think many countries are more committed than ever and see the importance. And now is the time to do that. So I'm probably out of time, but afterwards I can come back to substance and specifically the WTO because I think there's hope there too.
Okay, so that's a call to action to ask the question during our Q&A portion. Next, I'd like to shift to kind of the topic of this session and in the EU's role in that. So, Eva, can we turn and look to the EU to be a leader? I think some points already made by Laurence and by Jake is that, the EU's unilateral measures like CBAM and deforestation regulation have been the topic at COPs a lot recently. So have they affected the perception of the EU's credibility in international climate negotiations?
Thanks a lot, Emily. And I know I'm always very young to Carolyn's skin. So let me maybe take on this question about EU's leadership from maybe taking a very large look at what EU's leadership is. EU's leadership is a leadership of necessity. EU's leadership is mostly reactive and very rarely proactive. And we have seen this kind of rare spark of this proactive leadership with the coming of the Green Trade Deal. That was one instance where we saw the EU having a vision and really coming at it towards people who were not expecting that. That was the leadership that was a real one. I think the last one we have seen of that type was around the 90s when we created the WTO in the years when GATT was started by some of the EU members. And there is a reason why EU tends to be reactive rather than proactive, and it's institutional setup. If you look at EU's politics, you will see immediately, especially on trade matters, why EU can by itself almost never be a mission. We have so many, and I'm still saying we, as you can imagine, hands die hard, but we are still a combination of all the interests that we have within the EU, and you just need to look at Germany to see exactly what that means. So the Green Wave, and I would say that the French visionary approach to the green policies allowed EU to stay at those new trade-related climate or other climate-related trade regulations that have been controversial, but also that allowed the EU to actually start pushing the global climate agenda forward. As we are working as ISD globally in many countries, we see that no other piece of regulation has made a bigger impact in terms of carbon pricing discussions than what CBAM did. But those two things came with big shock to global trade community, and frankly speaking, with a very different design. One of them took 2 years to socialize, and I think at this point we arrived at a place where countries are able, at least at the WTO, to discuss CBAM without having major allergies to that, where a conversation is actually starting to happen, and even where you can see countries like China playing this intermediate role, trying to see where the consensus could go towards that. And you still have EUDR. I'll just stop there. Everybody knows what the problem is there. So, and that problem is not disappearing, by the way. Just let's when we're thinking about EU's leadership, let's try to look at the December, and we know that we are not the only ones who are looking at that December. The Brazilian COP presidency is also looking towards December and trying to guess what that will mean, and that will impact to the extent to which the EU can continue showing this leadership. But the EU's internal capacity to lead is no longer there. The green wave is there no more. The European Parliament and European elections have clearly shown that the green ideas are now struggling to survive within the EU, and I can imagine how much more work colleagues at DG Climat, for example, need to be doing in order to make sure that those ideas are not being sacrificed for the sake of competition. And this is, again, the big question of how to ensure the leadership in the environment where you cannot yet formulate a big idea of how you want the next generation multilateral trading system to look like. How can this fit in your competition objectives, your needs of defense policy, and keep sustainability alive in those ideas? How can you present this package to the organization and be credible with that? It's a huge challenge. I will not pretend that it's a small figure, but even if we're using CBAM as an example, the way the export rebates and downstream expansion conversations will go will determine how credible EU will be seen moving ahead there. The solutions there will be very difficult, and they need to look credible in everybody's eyes. EU wants to continue to be seen as someone who's ready to spearhead the climate ideas and look towards the future where those things can stay. So a couple of things, maybe just kind of my recipe, my prescription for the EU if it wants to keep the leadership. No magic bullets there, really, honestly speaking. Having a big picture and big vision really helps. Having a random regulation come in and hoping that it will work. EUDR, everyone. Keeping sustainability as part of that picture and keeping it at the heart of this new agenda for the multilateral trading system needs to be there, because not many other countries will be willing to step up for that. If EU doesn't, those ideas will definitely be put on a back burner until the next time where economy grows again. And it's going to take a while. EU needs to find ways to be practical and not moralistic. So creating solutions that can actually be workable. And last thing, have friends. Going it alone is a challenge, and having partnerships, not only investing in those partnerships, but actually having partners and working with partners, not only the types of partners that would direct you, but others, is also something that is useful. Those are lessons of smaller WTO members and smaller members of the multilateral trading system. But it should not be beyond the EU to actually look for meaningful partnerships in this way. Awesome.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a good way to segue to you, Eli, and talk about solutions. So what practical steps can the EU take to rebuild that trust and demonstrate leadership in the kind of global trade climate nexus?
Great, sure. So thank you very much for having me. So I teach climate finance at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'm going to be quite critical of the CBAM in the next 5 minutes. But I want to start by describing how I talk about the CBAM to my students, which is that basically for the first time in the history of the world, it is now in countries' economic interest to impose carbon pricing. So like for the first time ever, because of a measure from the European Union, countries all over the world are realizing the reason to impose a carbon price, the reason to tax carbon, is not some altruistic thing about global decarbonization, it's to keep the revenue at home. So the CBAM is an amazing measure in pushing forward carbon pricing, which probably half the room economists we've all been talking about for a very, very long time. The issue, though, is that it is not perceived by developing countries in that way. If you have a one-on-one conversation with a developing country policymaker, I came to Brussels, I'm based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I came to Brussels from Mozambique, South Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, and Kenya. And I was talking to all of these governments about climate policy in general, but also a lot about the CBAM. And they don't view this as the natural corollary to the ETS. They say, okay, you've put in place the CBAM, and you have this thing called a deduction for a carbon price effectively paid. This is under Article 9. And you get to deduct the tax, the fee, or the levy in your home country. And they say one of three things can happen. Either I in Mozambique, or I in South Africa, or I in Turkey, I can impose a carbon price at the exact same level of the EU ETS, which is calibrated for the EU economy and took you 20 years to build. And you're expecting me to do that in the next year. I can do that, $80, $85, eventually maybe $100 once the CBAM is phased in. So I can impose a carbon price that honestly is probably not right for my economy. I can engage in basically a wealth transfer from global south to global north. So I'll be paying you this tariff at a time when the EU is trying to lead on reducing tariffs and free trade. Or I can stop trading with the EU. And those are basically the three options that developing country policymakers say. Now, to me, all three of those are bad. We should be encouraging global carbon pricing. And I started by saying, I love the CBAM. I love that it's encouraging global carbon pricing. Brazil just passed the ETS because of the CBAM. That's a huge effect. But that's going to be $15 a ton, maybe $20 a ton, nowhere near the EU level. And if you get to deduct your local carbon price, you're going to be left with this kind of difference, this delta. It's going to have to be paid by developing country exporters. It's actually paid by the importers, but in the incidence of the tax, it's going to end up being borne by the price mechanism to the EU. And so to answer your question directly, like I think there are a whole range of policy solutions the EU can engage in. A couple were actually proposed during the CBAM legislative process. So yesterday I had a meeting with Horace Thomas from DG Taxud, with Mohammed Shaheen from the Parliament. The two ideas that really got thought about, as far as I know, during the legislative process were exemptions for LDCs, maybe a sort of graduated carbon price depending on the level of development. That was rejected in part because it's not WTO compliant, and in part because it might allow for carbon leakage. So if you allow other countries to not pay a carbon price or a lower carbon price, you're shooting EU exporters or EU manufacturers in the foot. Or you can have some sort of revenue recycling, where you take in the money and you give it back. That was also rejected. I think there's a lot of reasons for this. Maybe it's because it would mechanically massively increase European ODA. You'd actually just be giving out money, and that is politically sensitive. But what I think the EU is serious about, and there are EU decision makers in the room, I get the sense that the EU would actually rather not collect the CBAM revenue. They genuinely would rather that there was a carbon price that meant developing countries keep this revenue at home. So what do? One option, and there are many, and I'm just going to talk about the one I wrote, is a paper that I wrote with some colleagues from Harvard that we presented at COP last year. We wrote it with the Azerbaijani COP presidency and the Brazilian COP presidency, and talked about it to a whole load of policymakers. It's basically to change what the EU considers an effective carbon price, a carbon price effectively paid. I know this sounds super wonkish. I'm talking about the definition in Article 9 with reference to Article 2 of the CBAM regulation, but it's basically what you get to deduct. And at the moment, the EU is saying, it's actually not in the law, but the EU is saying de facto, you need a carbon price that looks a lot like the EU ETS on all of the aluminium, or all of the fertilizer, or all of the steel you produce in your economy. And it needs to be at the level of the EU price, but you're going to have to pay us. And I think we should have a much, much wider definition of what is an effective carbon price. For example, let's say Mozal, this is the big aluminium producer in Mozambique. Let's say they spend $100 million investing in the grid of Mozambique. That $100 million maybe is a form of investment in decarbonization. And there could be ways to allow you to deduct that from your CBAM bill. This, for example, could be via something called Article 6 credits, part of the UNFCCC mechanism. So maybe if an exporter of the EU spends X dollars on Article 6 credits, they could deduct X dollars from their CBAM bill. It's sort of like a voluntary carbon tax. You're paying an amount of money for carbon credits. That amount of money, maybe you can deduct from your CBAM bill. Alternatively, a solution we've talked to a lot of developing countries about is you set up a fund in the country, a fund for decarbonization. The Brazilians were talking to the smart presidency, they actually already have one. It's run by the National Development Bank, by BNDES, and it's a fund for Amazon preservation. The problem with this fund is it has no money in it. And so maybe Brazilian exporters to the EU, mostly fertilizer from Brazil, the difference between the Brazilian ETS and the EU ETS, they could pay in as a voluntary contribution to the Brazilian fund, as a levy, according to Article 2 of the CBAM regulation. What would this do? It would keep the incentive to decarbonize, because you're still paying an effective carbon price, you're still paying the same amount. Brazil wouldn't have to have an ETS that's calibrated to the level of the EU, but it would keep all the revenue at home. These are the kind of ideas that we think we should be talking about. That bear in mind, what is it the EU wants? The EU wants to defend the level playing field in ETS. What does it developing countries want? They want not to write a check to the EU. Are those two goals compatible? I think yes. I talked about this yesterday, and I have over the last many months with a lot of European policymakers. At the moment, the Commission is quite tight-lipped, and so they basically say it is not our role to go out and tell developing countries how to respond. If they come to us with a proposal at COP or in the G20, maybe we can reply. So I know there's a huge range of people that have been assembled by Antoine and Pierre in the room. So if there's people that work with developing countries, I think my sense is the EU is really willing to listen to innovative proposals that are brought to them. That's why we're working with the COP presidency. There are also things the EU could do. So I think like being more proactive in saying we want to be flexible, we want to allow you to tax carbon in a way that is effectively paid in your own jurisdiction that works. There are ways I'd be happy to work that are more proactive, but that is kind of my fundamental point at the end. It's like when the CBAM was being designed, I think all the economists in the room thought that everyone would be welcoming this. Like developing countries are trying to push the EU to decarbonize. The EU is doing that via the ETS. It is not logical to expect the country to have an ETS without a CBAM. Why isn't everyone happy? It's not actually because of CBAM. I think it's because there's not a flexibility in how you are able to respond. Essentially, what carbon pricing does. I'm going to pause there and happy to talk more.
Thank you so much. Some really practical points. Then I'd like to turn back to the political and the political elephant, if you will. David, the transatlantic relationship, of course, cannot be ignored. Considering the current U.S. administration's aggressive trade policies, is there still a role for the transatlantic relationship in advancing climate ambition? And how do you think these rising tensions impact the EU's ability to lead globally on climate initiatives?
Thank you so much, Emily and the Trade Network for inviting us and great presentations that were made beforehand. I have a really, really short answer to the first question that you asked, which is no. Of course, yeah. Can you hear me better now? Yes. So I don't think there's potential for the transatlantic relationship to advance climate ambition globally at this point. There may be potentially ways forward to cooperate and advance on the basis of EU city, US city, or US state. US state level, but that remains to be seen. Things are very, very chaotic right now, as we all know. So I wouldn't put my eggs into that basket. That doesn't mean, of course, that there's not plenty of potential for the EU to improve on the effectiveness and legitimacy of its own climate policies and establish itself as a leader on green trade. And the CBAM, I think, as has been previously said, is an important case in point. That is to ask how can we improve the CBAM implementation to maximize the climate benefits and the fairness in light of the CBDR principle, while leveling the playing field on domestic and foreign and domestic producers at the same time. So that's of course a lot to ask, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the solutions or some of the solutions that Eli has just mentioned, and perhaps arrive at a slightly different conclusion. That is to say, CBAM carbon price crediting, the CBAM carbon price crediting mechanism under Article 9 is of course a really, really important means to achieve these three objectives, and could potentially involve relatively minimal trade-offs. And in the forthcoming paper with colleagues at RFF, we argue that the CBAM carbon price, so that is essentially the argument, just to say that CBAM carbon price crediting is an important incentive, of course, for carbon taxation in third countries, depending on how we convert those carbon prices into a credit. But also very, very big challenge, of course, is for lower income countries, income economies, to impose an industry-wide carbon price at the level of the ETS, as I just said, and because it's simply not an option, as we would suffocate domestic economic activity that relies on such highly carbon price domestic supply. So we can, for instance, take the example of South Africa, which has a very high steel and aluminum export exposure to the EU, and purchasing power adjusted per capita GDP of about 1/4 GDP. So that is a very disparate level, a very, very divergent level of economic development, of course. And South Africa has adopted a carbon tax scheme that currently stands at €7 per ton of CO2, with rising to €21 per ton in 2030, and that is roughly 1/4 of the average EU carbon price. But even with an ambitious trajectory, so South Africa will never reach the same level of carbon pricing as the EU, and therefore jeopardizing the export competitiveness despite a high level of ambition relative to economic development. So how should we possibly, ideally, credit carbon prices paid in the country of product origin to allow those economies with different levels of development to maintain export competitiveness while leveling the playing field, setting incentives for industrial decarbonization, etc. And there's somewhat industrious initiative that Eli has already mentioned, I think, is to exclusively tax exports to the EU at the EU ETS price. That came from the Indian government. The Commission said, no, this is not how we imagined it. Of course, you could retain your funds for your own budget that way, but we need a sector-wide carbon price in order to avoid resource shuffling and barriers and WTO compatibility, etc. There have been other proposals, including the conversion of carbon price for trading purposes at the level of per capita GDP or purchasing power. So that would is a graduated carbon price that Eli was talking about a little bit earlier. Now, carbon price crediting that would achieve or deliver on all three objectives of climate, CBDR, and level playing fields would probably have to involve a combination of these different solutions, and that could look as follows. That means if a country, the third country, imposes a domestic carbon price that is equivalent to the EU ETS price relative to per capita GDP and adjusted by purchasing power, then CBAM carbon price crediting should arguably allow for a full credit on an EU-only much higher carbon export tax in order to level the playing field. And that, has a number of advantages. It allows third countries to retain the revenue that would otherwise go to the EU budget. It would retain the level playing field among exporters to the EU and between EU exporters and or between EU producers and and exporters, and it respects obviously the CBDR principle, different development levels, and is likely, possibly, WTO compatible. So this could be one of the sweet spots as proposed to the European Commission. As we know, there's an implementing act coming up that is meant to be published in the second half of this year on the means of the modalities of the conversion of carbon prices for crediting purposes, and it remains to be seen whether the Commission is willing to take into account only the exchange rate or factors in some of these other solutions.
Thank you so much. I think now we'll turn to some audience questions before I allow my panelists to battle it out. But we'll take a few short. In blue, yes.
Do you want to?
We have a microphone coming to you. Or you can just shout a little louder.
Record for the audience online.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Marius Stoos. I work at a Dutch NGO called Organised. We work on a lot of trade-related stuff. I was very piqued by what you said about the WTO, so I had a couple of questions in that regard, or actually one main question. It seemed like you, or at least some of the panelists and some of the previous ones, still have a lot of hope for the WTO. I know the EU does as well. I heard the DG Trade say the other day that they a lot of their focus and they're still on basically on the WTO, but WTO has already been in a bit of a rough patch these last few years with the dispute settlement not working anymore, and with the US now in these past few weeks doing pretty much everything that the WTO says is intended to prevent. I was really wondering how you see the role of the WTO going forward. And also, I think at some point you mentioned that there's developing countries are still very positive about the WTO. I was at MC13 last year. I noticed a lot of frustration with the WTO process, and also especially when it comes to agriculture, fisheries, and things like that. So with all these things in mind, what my question really is how do you see the future of the WTO? Where does your hope stem from? And is it still fit for purpose in its current form? With some of the countries basically at the basis of the WTO now gone.
Thank you so much. We'll take a few if there are more questions. And please keep your questions short so we can get as many as possible.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lukas Hömpel from the Wuppertal Institute in Germany. I wanted to challenge or maybe add a thought to what Laurent said on how EU has become the enemy of the US. My personal thinking is that perhaps it's not the EU per se, but the rule of law that's the enemy of the current US administration. And because the EU is kind of the hallmark of the EU of law, it has become the enemy. But what does that mean for trade? Because if we are dealing with the US, it's kind of disregarding the rule of law per se. It's not about, like, if Pacta sunt servanda, it doesn't count for the US anymore. The rule of law is only the rule of the might is right. How can we then kind of trust these global governance arrangements and even negotiate with them? I'm a bit desperate, and I was hoping for some hope restoration. Caroline, you made the point so clearly that hope is so needed. Yeah, I just wanted to hear your views on that. Thanks.
Thank you. And then one more question.
Yeah, quickly, I would love to hear, Eli, do you really think that, David, do you really think that least developed countries have the capacity, the institutional capacity to enact a ETS? One. And Eli, I'd love to hear your response to David's.
Okay, I think we'll start with some answers. Let's try to keep it as concise as possible so we can get to some more questions. I'll start with Caroline. I know that's the challenge, but you wanted to make some points in the WTO section. That would be a good place to start.
Thanks. No, I really appreciate your question, and it's one that I and all of our team at TESS ask ourselves every day. Well said. I think part of my answer depends on what you think the WTO is for, who it is for, and what are the range of things it could do. if you see the WTO only, I mean, it has a range of functions, and obviously the dispute settlement function is core. Notably, many of the countries in the past week concerned about Trump tariffs have gone and presented cases, presented complaints to the WTO in the last week. So that says something about their belief, at least in using this system as a way of setting a sort of policy narrative or a legal narrative about what is okay and not okay in the context, whereas the other gentleman said rule of law is kind of a bit fluid at the moment. So I think that there's everything from that. A lot of people are obsessed with the idea that WTO is not relevant if it's not generating new agreements. Obviously, that would be nice, but it depends on what kind of agreements and who for. I think my feeling is that there are many kinds of cooperation that are underway at the WTO that don't involve the generation of new rules, and we shouldn't discount its importance because of that. It's still a vitally, and so my point would be, so today, in spite of Trump tariffs, 85% of world trade is not directly with the US. We know that 75% of world trade still is conducted under MFN rules, under WTO rules. So it's not to say that that US trade won't have all kinds of ripple effects on other economies, but the other 160 countries, 160 plus, are still standing and still believe in this forum. Now that also accounts for the fact that, of course, there are well-justified frustrations from many of the least developed and most vulnerable countries around the failure to deliver on agriculture, on cotton, on fisheries, on key sectors that matter for them. But they will be the last to walk away from that institution. And that is because even with its flaws, it is a place where they have more chance to bargain collectively, to set a policy agenda collectively, to have their voice heard collectively, and far more so than in bilateral relationships and other ones. Now, they can also pursue things regionally, South-South. There may be some wonderful trade partners with which they can forge good deals. I'm not discounting all of that, but I don't think that they will see a death to multilateralism as part of this. And then just quickly on the issue of climate and trade, I see this in the context of the fact that we had 25 years of almost nothing on this topic. So in the last 3 years, it has been a true renaissance, starting with some defensive frustration with the EU, but evolving into quite a healthy discussion around a range of issues that matter to countries. TRCMs is clearly one of them, and how to manage and reduce tensions around that. But also countries put on the agenda that they have a set of concerns around trade and climate adaptation. You know, Yeva is working on all around the impacts of the climate crisis on their trade and how they can manage, you know, hits on export revenues, implications for debt crises and so on. So countries are widening the range of topics as well. So sustainable agriculture, Brazil is leading an effort to spur more dialogue on that at the WTO. In the last few months, you've seen at the CTE discussions on trade and renewable energy access, trade and clean energy technologies. So for me, there's a vibrant discussion. Now, dialogue is not going to save the world, but I think it is a key element, and we can think about different kinds of outcomes. So what many members are discussing now is the idea of having guidance, not rules. Could you provide guidance on trade-related climate measures or on cooperation on green industrial policies in ways that would help set at least a floor or set a framework within which countries could hopefully act? It will provide guidance to parliaments, to stakeholders, to businesses, as well as governments on what to expect and what's realistic from when countries are trying. What's the right way to behave when you're designing some of these measures and policies, and how to do so fairly. I also think that we need to be flexible about what we think about multilateral outcomes. So I am very much an advocate of having an outcome on climate cooperation at MC14. I talk to a broad variety of ambassadors who think it's time, who recognize it's time. Many of those who in the past would not have been willing to step up on this. Now, what they will be able to produce collectively, we don't know, but the mere fact of having not just a recognition, which is pretty pathetic, the WHO at the moment that climate change and environmental crises matter, but that they need to work collaboratively and cooperatively to do something, is actually a big step forward in terms of setting the wider picture. And I think with the US, who knows what will happen, but I still think we can talk about a sort of multilateral statement from as many members as possible to this effect. It doesn't have to be a ministerial decision that's signed off by every member, but I think it's a much different approach than talking about a plurilateral one. Countries could still pursue plurilateral things if they want to, but I think this idea that we're saying, we can work collectively through multilateral organisation that will help shift the discourse and narrative on these issues would be really important. I don't know if that makes sense. I probably spoke too long. Sorry.
No, I think you're incredibly useful and impressive how much you got in such a short time. So Eva, you wanted to add something here.
Yes, and I think absolutely, as Karen was mentioning, we should not be losing the sense of the progress that has been made at the WTO in terms of climate and environmental issues. Those 2 years have been revolutionary, and I think Karen has been at the heart of so many processes. So she's an excellent person to be talking about it. But at the same time, as an organization who has been at the heart of multiple multilateral negotiations, including, I think somebody mentioned fisheries, fish. I want to say one thing, none of the outcome and none of the deals that you see eventually arising are born of euphoria. Those are all born of desperation, chaos, and really just endless grinding teeth. That nobody is hugging trees and coming up with international trade agreement. This is not how it goes. And this EU has already wasted the crisis of Trump 1. If you remember well, just a few years back, we had this conversation about institutional reform, and we felt like that will be enough. And the moment this has quieted down, we also somehow forgot that that was supposed to be happening. But the big issues that are creating pressures in the organization are nowhere gone. We still have major discussions about the state's role in the economy, the subsidies, the industrial policies. They have been brewing for decades by now. The big issues in agriculture are nowhere gone. It's just that the major players tend to stick to the status quo because it's kind of very evolving. And now with the EU kind of bursting that part, it's another opportunity to actually strategically think on what organizations expected to be doing, what do we need it for, how can we look at that and create a completely new architecture for rules that have not been serving the broader trade community that well, but will that opportunity use as a completely different question.
Thank you. I think then we'll turn to the provocation, if I can call it that, on CBAM. So maybe I'll start with you, Eli, and then turn to David.
Sure, thanks a lot. So I think it's a great question about what can we and what should we expect developing countries to do in response to the CBAM. One answer is decarbonize. So hopefully that'll happen, and that will ultimately lower your CBAM bill. But there is going to be a tax liability, an amount that has to be paid on goods exported from all the EU trading partners to the European Union. Specifically on LDCs, I think the answer to whether or not there is the state capacity to build an ETS, the answer is probably no. With LDCs, it actually, with the possible exception of Mozambique, doesn't do that. LDCs export textiles, raw commodities, and agricultural products to the EU. They're much more worried about the EU methane regulation, which will be a whole separate topic I'd be interested in speaking about. The amount of goods actually in CBAM sectors from LDCs, very, very, very small. Which in my mind actually makes something like an exemption a no-brainer. It's a small amount of revenue for the EU and a large comparative amount for LDCs. I think the real question is much more about kind of low-income or middle-income countries. We're talking Brazil, India, Nigeria, South Africa, and then Mozambique. Whether there is institutional capacity, I think maybe. It would be a huge lift and it would be a massive change, and you'd need a lot of support that is not really there currently. But I actually just go back to the fundamental question of, do we think that these countries should have, is that the optimal, an ETS that is trading at the same level as the EU? The EU ETS, just to be clear, is whatever it is trading at now, $75 a ton. That is not actually the price of the EU ETS. With all the free allowances, it's probably about, someone in the room better than me, $20, $25. And so to think that within 5 years, developing countries should reach double, triple, quadruple that is quixotic in my mind. And so then I would return to, what is it the CBAM can do? I think the CBAM on the current path will lead to either developing countries not trading with the EU because they don't want to impose these carbon prices and they don't want to give money to the EU, which would raise prices in Europe even more than the phase out of free allowances already would. And I think there's a risk that the ETS and the CBAM then fail. Like I've had a lot of arguments with other economists in Harvard and MIT, a woman called Catherine Wolfson, because the traditional economist view is like, this is our chance. The CBAM is our chance to have every country on earth impose a carbon price at $85. And that's how we decarbonize. And doing anything that undermines that incentive is bad, because we're losing our chance for a worldwide carbon price. And my view is actually, the CBAM is a chance to have an $85 a ton carbon price on all trade. And that is actually doable. And we could really have that happen if the EU allows flexibility in what carbon prices can be deducted. They allow it to be on exports to the EU, and they allow it to be on, let's say, a levy that's really, really simple to set up. And I've talked to the World Bank, for example, that they would come into each country, they would set up the fund. David mentioned that the Commission had previously rejected a proposal from India. My understanding of the reason they rejected it is because what they thought the Indians were going to do was tax exports, take the money, give it back to the exports. So you essentially would not have any incentive to decarbonize, and it's not a real tax. Final thing I'd say is like this world where we end up, and I think we can do it in 2 years. We can have 100% essentially of global trade covered by carbon taxes in 2 years, and be relatively easy to do. That completely changes the nature of global trade in goods related to carbon, because suddenly you have incentives for countries to push for higher carbon prices. There's a lot being said, I'm American, there's a lot being said about the United States here that I'm not going to comment on. What I would say is actually, a world with high carbon prices is really good for America. American goods are very, very, very clean. It's basically because we have cheap natural gas. So where the rest of the world uses oil and coal, we use natural gas. Maybe the 90th, occasionally the 80th percentile for all CBAM goods. So if you were to have this kind of foot in the door, this wedge, where global goods all over the world are exposed to carbon pricing, you will create a constituency in the United States and elsewhere that is arguing for more carbon pricing, goods that are produced cleanly. And so, like, to me, the immediate next step on the CBAM is to make it work. And the way you make it work is you allow developing countries to tax exports, and you allow them to do it in a flexible manner. But yeah, just briefly on David's proposal, we'll say more. I just believe in simplicity. Like, I can see why it's logical to have this graduated purchasing power adjusted ratio between an export tax and a domestic carbon tax. Whether that is actually going to be legislated, like trying to imagine a world where that happens, and then developing countries come to the EU and they figure out what the domestic tax should be and they reference it to the purchasing power parity, extremely unlikely. I think you need something simple that is not the EU dictating what the carbon price should be. It's saying if you pay an effective carbon price equal to ours, you can export tariff-free to our jurisdiction.
Yeah, let me just perhaps respond to that. I agree with a lot of what Eli just said, including that the EU should have a export, but there should be a global carbon price of $85. The question is, how do we achieve that? And one of the ways is indeed to allow for an export tax that retains full revenues for developing countries at home. But the background to that, indeed, I think, and the simplicity of the solution, but to do a pricing solution that I propose is that we have objective criteria by how to set the domestic, how to determine the level of minimum domestic carbon price that would have to be in place to unlock the flexibility of an export EU-only carbon tax, and that is purchasing power parity in per capita GDP. You can look that up on the internet; it's right there. So we just have to adjust that, to the EU carbon price, the ETS price, and we're there and have an objective benchmark. So that, and again, I think what we converge on is really the export tax, where it doesn't really matter, like for carbon pricing incentives, where the tax is paid, whether it's paid upon export or paid upon import. So the incentive is really about having that level, and at the same time retain the competitiveness among third country producers on different countries, because they all pay the same. They all pay the same carbon price, and retain the competitiveness. Very important for EU domestic political purposes. Retain the competitiveness of EU domestic producers vis-a-vis those exporters because they all pay the same price. So that is in a nutshell the simplicity, and therefore I think also the beauty of the idea. On the LDCs, just to briefly say that Mozambique is obviously a very prominent example that has always been mentioned because the nominal exports or the exports of aluminum to the EU nominal terms are very high, both in terms of EU share of those imports and for the Mozambique economy. But there's other countries, other LDCs as well that have, relative to their export revenues, very high export shares to the EU, and that matters. State capacity is, of course, very important. At the same time, I would perhaps submit that those countries are not alone in this, and that the EU has been traditionally very, very bad in its media diplomacy and PR, as in not to advertise for the many things that have been done. And the EBF or the same accounts for multilateral development banks that are very, very active in supporting countries to develop carbon pricing schemes and ETS. So I stopped there. Everybody is looking at me with a different face.
Thank you very much. So, like I promised, we've found all the answers in this last hour. I'm just kidding, but I think our panelists got us one step closer, and luckily we do have another session. So thank you so much for joining me. And I would encourage you who have questions left to approach them during the break.
Thank you so much. We'll have 15 minutes of coffee break, and we'll meet again here at 11:20 for the second part.
Yeah.